most of my life, even though I was a Christian at a pretty young age, for most of my life, I never really heard anyone talk about Jesus as though he was anything other than a historical figure.
I have to admit, I'm in the same boat. For most of my life, it was never proposed to me that Jesus could potentially not have even existed in history. But then again, I live in North Alabama, and the very concept of God even not existing was not a thing that was ever discussed or presented to me. So when I finally confronted the possibility that God could not exist, I could not help but go the direction of coming to the conclusion that he probably doesn't. But even then, after I realized that I was not convinced that a God does exist, I still thought of Jesus as a historical person. And just like my investigation of whether or not God exists, once I started looking into the facts surrounding Jesus' existence historically, I finally came to the conclusion that he's most likely a myth, like completely.
Even in school, talking to friends and people who were not Christians, I mean, it seemed like, for the most part, everyone accepted the idea that Jesus was a real guy. Whether you thought he was God or not was a whole separate issue, but the idea that he had existed seemed to be undisputed, at least in my own personal experience. But as I got older and got into my high school age, I started to hear more often this objection that some people believed that Jesus had never lived, that he himself was part of a mythology that Christians had created over time, that there never had been a person named Jesus who was born. He'd never lived, he never died a crucifixion, that all of this was just part of the myth.
Mythicism does have a somewhat long past, but most of that past is filled with claims and just a lot of things that are not evidentially supported. So the only kind of mythicism that I support and I hold to is minimal mythicism that is most plainly laid out by Richard Carrier in his On the Historicity of Jesus.
That Jesus himself was not a real historical person. Well, this is very foundational. The idea that Jesus lived is foundational to Christianity. You know, I want to be a Christian because it's true, but if I'm going to believe that this guy Jesus lived and died for my sins, then it needs to be true that he really lived, that he really existed.
Well, no, it doesn't. Like, Christianity doesn't necessitate that Jesus existed in history. You can definitely accept that Jesus did not walk on this earth but still remain a Christian, because what you're really looking for is the spiritual truth contained in Christianity. Because just some, Jewish fuck in the first century walking around claiming that he's God is not going to accomplish what Christianity wanted to accomplish. What Christianity wanted to accomplish was to absolve the sins of the Jewish people, give them a route to heaven that they can easily attain and retain. That's the point of it. The entire point of Christianity is his death, resurrection, and absolution of sins. Not that he existed. His death, resurrection, and absolution of sins could have totally been done in a celestial realm, much like other dying and rising gods of the time, most namely Osiris. Now, Osiris, he had earthly tales told about him where he was a physical person on this earth, but then in the higher ups of the cult, what you had was this understanding that all of the stories told in the lower parts of the cult that were supposedly taking place on Earth were actually taking place in the celestial realm, and that everything that Osiris did was contained in the celestial realm. So with this notion and the fact that cults around this area where Christianity sprung up most likely influenced the originators of Christianity, it's easy to see that you do not need a physical presence on this earth in order for the first Christians, the real first Christians that we don't know a thing about. It's very plausible that they took this Jesus figure to have done all of this in the celestial realm, because this celestial realm was a physical place to them. I mean, this was taking place in the lower parts of the firmament, like right on top of the earth. That's supposedly where Satan is. So these were physical places. They just were not on the face of the earth, but rather on top of the earth. And this is all found in the cults of the time. It's really outrageous to say that Christianity was any different, most namely because in the Jewish scriptures, they explicitly say that the firmament was a physical place, that Satan was contained there, as well as shit happening in the celestial realm.
So it kind of begs the question, is there good evidence to believe that Jesus himself even existed historically? Even before we get to the question about whether he was God, did Jesus even live? Was he ever born? Did he ever die?
No. Wow, that was a good video. How y'all guys like that?
I did.
Thank you, honey.
You're welcome.
I think there are actually some good reasons to believe that Jesus is a true historical person. One thing that I never see, at least in my personal experience, I've never seen any person argue that the disciples, the followers of Jesus, or the people who said they were followers of Jesus, the earliest Christians, that they did not exist. And I think it's easy to see that they existed because these people not only wrote letters and books, which ended up being in our Bible, they not only had different historical impact, but they had followers that they taught, essentially their own disciples, who then wrote about them.
All of this is horse shit. For one thing, the minimal mythicist position, the only empirically supported position, definitely states that the disciples most likely didn't exist. Because if Jesus didn't exist, then his disciples definitely didn't exist. He alludes here to the disciples writing letters and books that eventually came to be in the New Testament. But what he's assuming here are that the named authors on the Gospels are the ones that wrote those books. They aren't. The idea that the named authors are the ones that wrote the books didn't come into being until like the middle to late 2nd century. For all that we can tell, the disciples were invented with the Gospels. These Gospels were initially untitled. They were just known as the Gospel of Jesus at the time. And then several different sects had different ideas about what Jesus supposedly did while he was on this earth. So they copied and redacted other gospels that had appeared so that they could push their own narratives. Paul was the first one to write about a supposed Jesus Christ. He never mentions anybody as a disciple. He only mentions people as apostles of Jesus. Now, apostles are not people that walked with Jesus. Those would be disciples. Apostles were those that had received a revelation from Jesus and had studied the scriptures while smoking some pot. Those were the apostles, which Paul considered himself an apostle. So if the disciples didn't exist, then the disciples definitely didn't have any disciples of their own. Any claims of anybody being a disciple of, let's say, the Apostle John, only come from later claims of that person, not the person themselves claiming to be the disciple of the Apostle John, but just other people looking to source their information directly to a disciple and making shit up.